So to follow on that, our last speaker of the afternoon session is Dr. Pamela Heaton, who's a professor of psychology from the University of London at Goldsmiths College. And Pamela has really led the way in music intervention in children with autism, along with many investigators around the world. And she's going to talk to us about that this afternoon, and I'm sure we're all very anxious to hear you. Thank you, Pamela, for traveling all the way and sort of missing the last bit of the Olympics. We didn't count on that part. Sorry. Although TV coverage is quite good here, too.
Well, I have to confess, I'd much rather listen to these fascinating talks than watch the Olympics, especially in the rain. Okay, I think I probably should start by talking a little bit about what autism is. We use the term autism spectrum disorder increasingly, and I believe for DSM-5 the plan is that we will move over to that description. And that's really to reflect the incredible variation within this disorder. Even though the disorder has a biological base, we do actually diagnose it on the basis of behavioural tests. And we have what was described by Lorna Wing, a triad of impairments. So we have difficulties with socialization, difficulties with communication, and we also see something that seems quite related to those two areas, which are probably going to merge in DSM-5, which is we see restricted interest in repetitive behaviours in these individuals as well, particularly early on in childhood. And this picture is really about the nicest example I've seen of a small child who has a plan for what happens at bedtime. And he would notice probably if that small duck was transposed with a different duck. You know, they have to be absolutely, completely in that order. Okay. We see that one of the things that's really striking about ASD, and it's something we don't tend to see in other neurodevelopmental disorders to anything like the same extent, this extreme heterogeneity. So we see people who, it takes us a while to realize they actually do have autism. And then, of course, we see people who are extremely, extremely handicapped. And people tend to, on the whole, we see people who are intellectually able showing fewer autism symptoms, but that's not always the case because we can see people who are very, very bright. We have several extremely high, intelligent adults in our sample who are really quite socially impaired, much more impaired than people who are less intelligent. So those two different aspects of the disorder, even though they often do correlate, can also be quite separate. So we see highly articulate autistic people who will score, in the average range or well above the average range on standardized tests of language, particularly within the areas of grammar and vocabulary. When we start thinking about paralinguistic language, prosody, and things like understanding sarcasm and irony, we see universal deficits. So even these very, very able individuals have problems with those kind of more subtle, nuanced aspects of speech and articulation. And there are a significant number of people with autism that never learn to talk, so they stay nonverbal throughout the whole of their lives. Okay, and there, oh dear, sorry. The issue of IQ is very interesting because it's very difficult to understand what autistic intelligence is like if we use a standardized test of intelligence, like the Vector skills, for instance, because sometimes we'll see a child come out with an IQ of 100, but the child actually has got an extraordinarily high non-verbal IQ and quite a low verbal IQ. So this kind of uneven profile we often see across different social cognitive domains, it can be quite misleading. And with very low IQ, also, we have to be quite careful about how we interpret test results, because so many of the questions are couched in a way that is quite difficult for people with a communication disorder to actually understand. Okay, and something that we're seeing much more, and in fact, in the recent large-scale study in the UK, we found that comorbidity with other kinds of disabilities is the norm rather than the exception. We don't really see pure cases of autism. We see sensory, motor, and other kinds of difficulties. In the earlier talk with the infants, we saw how important those sensory motor abilities are for developing communication skills and for synchronizing our behaviors with other people. And it's almost certainly the case that these children have those kind of sensory perceptual problems early on in development. Okay, we know autism is a biologically based disorder, but when we're thinking about music, the most interesting thing to think about really is the kind of emotional aspects of the disorder and the emotion deficit-based accounts of autism. And the very first one really came from Kanner, who was the first person to ever describe autism as a syndrome rather than as a symptom, for example, in schizophrenia. And he made a study of 11 children with what he called disturbance of affective contact. So his notion was that the main core problem with these children was their inability to form affectional bonds with other people. And that work was picked up in the UK by Peter Hobson, who did a lot of very good experimental work looking at the extent that autistic children understood expressions on faces and in voices. And now there's a very large body of research showing these kind of pervasive problems in understanding emotional cues from other people. They're quite variable, these difficulties, and they seem to correlate very highly with intelligence. So we can often do a sort of standard Ekman face emotion recognition task, and we'll find lots of autistic people will actually pass and they'll be able to recognize all of those emotions. But in the studies where someone will morph a neutral face in, so the angry face has got 10, 20% of neutral morphing, then the autistic people begin to show their deficit. So the system, they're not without the ability to recognize social emotions, but it is just that it is quite impaired. Okay, now we don't see this situation when it comes to music. We see quite a different picture. So there have been quite a lot of behavioral studies that have suggested that children with autism seem to understand the emotional connotations of music in very much the same way as typically developing children with the same level of verbal intelligence. So these pictures on the slide here are ones that were used in a study that we carried out in 2006. And we tested a very, very large sample of typically developing children, about 250 children aged between 6 and 10. And we had a large group of children with Down syndrome and a large group of children with autism. And the idea was that children with Down syndrome are very socially orientated. And if the ability to understand emotions in music was related to your interest in people, then we would expect the children with Down syndrome to do rather better than the children with autism. What the children listened to pieces of music, and they had an array of pictures showing emotional scenarios. And after each picture, each extract of music, they had to point to the picture they thought best matched it. So, for example, here, I think we had a bit of Beethoven Fifth Symphony for Triumph, which was the man with the cup. And we had a section of the fight scene from Prokofiev from Romeo and Juliet for the scene that was to do with anger. And what we found in this study of about 300 children was that diagnosis had absolutely no effect whatsoever on performance. The only thing that predicted performance was verbal mental age. And so this meant then that our children with autism who were not intellectually impaired were recognizing these emotions at exactly the same level as typically developing children. Okay, so there are some other kinds of studies, some neuroimaging studies as well on music and the brain, but I'm not going to talk about those at the moment. This study here was a qualitative study where we asked a group of highly articulate adults and adolescents what they thought music was about and what they used it for. And they described how they used music for self-medicating anxiety and depression, and for making links with other people, and also for the simple pleasure of it. And it was quite striking how, when we looked at the data from this study in the context of other kind of studies that have looked at the uses of music in neurotypical development, they were extraordinarily similar, really. There was no real difference between them. when I said that autistic people listen to music for fun, I just thought I'd share this poem, this segment of this poem with you from Craig Romkina, who's a very, very fine poet with autism. And he said, "Someday I will write a symphony from the chords I've collected in my mind, someday just for fun. In the meantime, I will listen and listen and listen till I'm filled to the brim with joy." And I think that seems to sum up an awful lot of the things that we hear when we have people coming in to do music experiments in our laboratory. So the findings showing this ability to understand the emotional connotations of music, it's made us reappraise the way that we consider the emotion deficit in autism. Early on, of course, we all assumed that it was just a domain general disability. They just don't get emotions. They can't do it. But then to find that actually they could do it rather well within one domain made us realize that we've got the wrong kind of idea about what the emotion processing deficit is to do with. And we really did need to have a finer grain approach to understanding this kind of problem in autism. So quite recently, there's been a surge of interest in the comorbidity of alexithymia with autism. Now, alexithymia means without words for emotions, and there are two types of alexithymia. So the first one is that the individuals with type 1 alexithymia fail to experience emotions. They don't need to have words for them. They just don't feel emotional responses to external stimuli. And the second type is that they experience emotions, but they can't cognitively appraise or describe their emotional experiences. And Elizabeth Hill, who's a colleague of mine at Goldsmiths, did quite a large-scale study of autistic adults. And she found that 85% of people with autism were comorbid for alexithymia, and it was type 2 alexithymia, not type 1. So the idea was that they feel the emotions, but they can't find the words for them. So it's a cognitive problem. I should just mention, actually, that we assess type 2 alexithymia using the Toronto Alexithymia Scale, and it's actually a very, very good assessment. And that we've also, people are also beginning to use neuroimaging, and that has really been able to draw links between what we see on the scanner and what kind of scores people achieve on the alexithymia questionnaire. So I feel it's quite a reliable test. Okay, we know that alexithymia predicts depression and anxiety in autism. So in that sample, we'll see people with autism who don't have very low scores for alexithymia deficits. They're really quite good at describing their emotions. So their deficits all focused around their social and emotional communication problems, but they're not terribly bad at understanding emotions, and they are less depressed and they're less anxious. We did a study recently where we looked at whether or not type 2 alexithymia would predict difficulties in recognizing emotions in voices in autism, and actually also in typical controls, and it was very highly predictive. So we see research linking difficulties in recognizing one's own emotions with the emotions of other people and poor psychological well-being in autism. So this is a major problem. We have lots of descriptions in our lab from people telling us that they feel a sort of a brooding darkness. They don't know what's the matter, but they feel this terrible fear. I think we all experience that occasionally, but quite quickly we can work out what's going on with us. But that seems to be quite a pervasive state for these people. Okay. If we think about alexithymia in terms of a musical model, we can think about this two-stage model. So the first is that we see a low level of emotional response that includes components of physiological arousal. We've heard quite a bit about this already today, about how these physiological responses are such a big part of the emotion experience. And in stage 2, we see the interpretation of the arousal in complex emotion terms. So this involves a conscious awareness of the induced emotions and the ability to identify them by name. So Rory Allen, who's in our lab, has recently tested this model in a study of 23 intellectually able adults with autism and typical comparison participants. These are quite interesting people. They're all people who have jobs in the community. So they're all actually interfacing with other people all the time. So these difficulties in emotional understanding really do impact on them quite severely. What he did in the first study, or the first phase of the study, was he gave them all a long list of words, 28 words, that they could study. They could spend as long as they wanted studying those words, and they included things like exhilarated, happy, dramatic, longing, etc. And then they were played 6 musical extracts, and they were asked to tick all of the words that evoked that feeling in them, and that was important. It was what it made you feel like. And what we found was that compared to a comparison group matched on age and intelligence, that they ticked significantly fewer words than the comparison participants. But when we actually put the type 2 alexithymia scores into the regression analysis, the group difference disappeared then. So that was explaining all the difference between the groups. And this was consistent with earlier neuroimaging work carried out by people like Jeff Bird in the UK. And they've shown that it's really the comorbid alexithymia and not the autism seems to be responsible for a lot of the difficulties that we believe are to do with having autism. Okay, so this was the second phase of the study. I'm sorry, it's very faint. This was kind of concerned with thinking about conventional pairings. The study I told you about earlier was carried out with children. And we saw then that they could work out that Prokofiev meant anger when he wrote the fight scene in Romeo and Juliet. So it's a conventional pairing. It's not talking about what I feel like. So these were individuals who weren't very good at generating words for what I feel like in response to music. So he gave them these, they had 6 word bundles, and they had new musical extracts, and they had to pair them with these word bundles. So which word bundle is best to explain in this music? But the important thing was here, was that what would other people, what do you predict other people would choose? Which of these word bundles would they choose to go with this piece of music? And they actually did slightly better than the controls. There was no significant difference between the groups. So these people who couldn't attribute emotion terms to their own feelings in response to music were perfectly able to understand what other people would think that music meant. So that's quite interesting. So at the final stage of the study, he did a GSR paradigm to measure physiological effects of listening to music minus listening to silence, and he found absolutely no group difference between the autism group and the group, the typically developing group. So this is what we would expect if we thought the verbal responsiveness to music was mediated by type 2 alexithymia. This should make us very, very wary of all the studies that have asked people with autism what music makes them feel like, and they say it makes me feel nothing. We have to be very wary because lots of things are going on that they're not able to access cognitively. So we see here that this deficit doesn't involve basic physiological emotional responses or deficits at that level. It's just difficulty in gaining cognitive access and full awareness of those kinds of labels, verbal labels. So a really important question in terms of looking at how we can help these people to function better in their everyday lives is looking at whether or not an impaired physiological responsiveness can be, in response to music, can be used to bootstrap understanding of more complex emotions. So hopefully they'd be able to take that out into the community and use that in their everyday lives. So we thought quite long and hard about what we think might have caused this inability to cognitively label one's own emotions in autism. And we came across this nice study by Marcelli, which showed that mothers mimic their infants' expressions of emotions. So if a little infant's got a lip sticking down because it's very miserable, the mother will do that back at the infant. And she'd probably also say something like, sad baby. So over time, the infant learns, when I feel like this is what I look like, and that's what it means. So they have this pairing of their internal arousal states with an emotional view and also an emotional word unfolding over time. And there's been a lot of research in autism looking at how they really have problems understanding other people's emotions, but really nobody until fairly recently has been very interested in thinking about how difficult they find it to understand their own emotions as well. Okay. One thing that we do know, if we think about Marcelli's study, we have this nice mother and infant interaction that's bootstrapping, understanding of personal emotions. We know from a lot of studies, sibling studies, that infants with autism don't really look at faces. They're not really very, often they don't look at faces, they don't make good eye contact. Eye contact is one of the bases that we use for diagnosis. So if you're not actually looking at parents, you aren't sort of profiting from those kind of learning experience or enabling them to bootstrap your understanding. And I think then you see difficulties in understanding other people's intentions, theory of minds, also their emotions, and also one's own emotions. So this is probably, we think this is probably how alexithymia arises. So I'm going to now describe a pilot study. It's literally just started, so I can't present any data, but I'll tell you what we're going to do, what's happening with the study. So it's with intellectually able adults with autism, and they were randomly allocated to treatment and control groups. So the participants initially learned to associate musical extracts that have already been shown to be associated with anger, fear, happiness, sadness, tenderness, and surprise. And we're trying to get them to start associating these with cognitive labels. So we hope that what's going to happen in the series of the therapy is they'll start to be able to use these extracts of music to acquire labels, to use those, and then generalize them to other kinds of situations. And that this will substitute that missing link in that normal developmental pathway. So these are what the visual images look like. It doesn't leave they're not very subtle. They don't leave much to the imagination. So you have a word and two different kinds of images. And they were all provided with an MP3 player, and they have emotion label folders inside. So they've got seven folders. So we've got happy, sad, angry, fearful, surprised, and tender. And each one of those folders has got this visual image with it of the emotion. And they've got musical extracts and their associated emotion icons. So we've got seven examples of sad music with the sad icon all in one folder on the MP3 player. And they have an online diary, and they describe their emotional experiences. So they're asked to say what caused the emotion. That's quite important, trying to work out what it was that made you feel as though your stomach was bubbling or you felt very tense or something, and to name the emotion if at all possible. If they come up with the label anger, they think it might possibly be anger that they're feeling, then they're encouraged to go into the anger folder. So they'll go through the anger folder and try and work out which one of those pieces most closely matches the way that they feel. If they don't find any, then they're encouraged to go into one that's maybe to do with sadness. So they're kind of probing all of these different kinds of emotions in order to try and match it to the one that they're feeling themselves. And they record this in the diary. Okay. And the control group also have autism. They're very, very similar types. And they undergo the same procedure, but their musical extracts, their folders have just got days of the week. So they'll be asked to think about the emotion they're experiencing and say it might be day 6, piece number 3. So they're just recognizing the musical piece, but we're missing out the label there. Okay. So the data analysis is based on pre-testing and post-testing for the treatment and control groups, and we will use measures of alexithymia again and other kinds of tests of social cognition and social functioning. And we're expecting, or we hope, the treatment group will show more improvement than the control group on this on this test. So it's aimed to remediate alexithymia in high-functioning individuals. And we particularly targeted we selected this kind of intervention for this group because their difficulties are so specific. You know, they don't have difficulties doing their jobs. Intellectually, it's very, very easy for them. They often have quite good everyday functional skills. That all the difficulties are around the interactions with the people that they interact with all the time. So we would hope that if we get some positive results, we would like to try and run the study with adolescents because it might be that we would see even more benefit if we can start instituting this kind of learning process at an earlier stage of development. Okay, thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Pamela, for that really terrific talk.